Hello everyone, I'm your host Nicole Wood, and welcome to Scicomm Monday. For those of you who are new to the broadcast, we try to make this as engaging a platform as possible, so please feel free to send in any of your questions via the Periscope chat module, and we'll do our best to answer them during the broadcast. If we don't get to your questions during the broadcast, or if you're watching this on replay, please feel free to send in questions via our various Twitter handles. You can reach me either at the Scicomm Monday Twitter handle or at my personal handle of WildlifeBioGal. And today we're going to be talking about forest and how healthy they are and the things that will impact that. And our guest today is Dr. David Coyle. He's from the University of Georgia. And with that, I'd like to welcome David to the broadcast. Thanks for being here, David.
Hey, Nicole. Thanks for having me.
So why don't you tell everyone a little bit about yourself so they know where you're coming from when it comes to your expertise on forest health?
Well, born and raised in the Midwest, and after spending a good chunk of time there, I did some my schooling at Luther College in Iowa and then a master's at Iowa State. Then I felt like it was time to fledge a little bit, and I left Iowa in the Midwest to come to South Carolina, and I worked down there for a while for the U.S. Forest Service. While there, I got into all the southern pine work, which is sort of our big tree crop in this part of the world. I also thought that it's too hot, and I fancied myself a hardy Midwestern, northern Scandinavian stock, so I went back to University of Wisconsin to do my PhD. And then during that time, I decided that was too cold, so I finished up, and I came back to Georgia for a postdoc a few years ago, and I've been working in southern forestry ever since. Most of it is southern pine, but I've done a lot of hardwood stuff too. And now I run a regional forest health program, so I work with universities and state forestry agencies across the whole southeastern region, which is 13 states from Texas to Kentucky to Virginia and everything underneath it.
Wow, that is quite a large swath of land there that you're having to deal with. So I'll throw out the first question while everyone's formulating their questions out there in Periscope land. But what are some of the biggest threats to forest nowadays?
The biggest threat is probably going to be invasive species. I'm sure most people are familiar with the emerald ash borer. In the southeast, we don't have quite as much ash as you do in the Great Lakes region, but it is fairly prevalent in a lot of the urban areas, so a lot of towns are poised to lose a lot of their street trees. And it does grow in all the southeastern states. Even Florida's got some ash. So we're kind of watching the spread of it. It's not going to have the same economic impact, but it's still going to keep moving and keep doing its thing. We also have this pest called the red ambrosia beetle, which carries a disease called laurel wilt. That's pretty devastating in its own right. It kills an entire family of trees, Lauraceae, so that's red bay, sweet bay, and then avocado is in there too. So the avocado industry is threatened. So you can make guacamole jokes, and all that type of thing. But
yeah, now that I actually have started liking avocados in the last couple of years to eat, like that would be devastating for me personally.
Well, yeah. It hasn't. It's hit the avocado industry a little bit, and that's kind of a small fraction of avocados as a whole. The big chunk of them is in California and Mexico, but there's clear host paths all the way into the big avocado regions. So we're sort of waiting. At this point, they've estimated it's killed 350 million red bay trees. And then when you factor in some of the other species, the pondberry and pond spice and sassafras, some have said probably 500 million trees have died because of this thing alone. So those are the big ones. Is the invasive species. New stuff is always coming in. People unwittingly move it from place to place, and it's a constant battle to keep ahead of it.
Yeah, when you say 5 million trees, was that what you said? 500 million trees die
Yeah.
off. Like what percentage of that, like how many trees are we talking about overall? So like people can kind of get a guess, like is 500 million trees? I mean, obviously it's a big number, but how does that number compare to the overall number of trees?
Well, boy, that's a tough one, Nicole. I can describe it this way. Right, a lot of those bay trees aren't commercially important. I mean, sure, we have bay leaves, right? That's one type, but it's one of those things where if you look at a forest that does and does not have laurel wilt, where there's laurel wilt, the understory just looks brown. Like it's almost like everything's dead because those bay trees are a huge chunk of the understory composition. And where that moves in, it changes the forest completely. Numerically, there's probably a lot more trees in that understory compared to those big ones, and it doesn't have a really huge economic impact. Those trees aren't really harvested for anything, but they're a huge part of the ecology, especially the southeast. There's a lot of insects that are specific to some of these trees. There's a lot of nice, especially showy butterflies and some of the big swallowtails we have. So it's a huge potential impact, and right now we have zero way to control it. One successful beetle attack means the tree's going to die. So it's tough. How many trees? A lot. I guess we'll just say a lot, right?
Kind of like they're almost uncountable is the number of trees.
Well, I think so. And part of the problem is some of these tree species, like sassafras, when it gets hit with laurel wilt, it looks like it is just dying of drought. So you get the leaves turn yellow, they start to droop, and then they fall off. So for these little ones that are only 1 or 2 feet high, if you don't see them within the first couple weeks of it getting hit, it's basically a dead stem out of the ground, and you have no idea how it died unless you start doing diagnostics. And who's going to do that when you're walking in the woods? You see a dead stick, you think, oh, that seedling died, and you kind of move on. But so it's tough to diagnose in some of these cases too.
So is that like help with its spread, that because it's not getting diagnosed that, okay, it's now in this county or in this state, it's able to go undetected, and the next thing you know, it's just all of a sudden exploded in that particular area?
Yeah, that's part of it. It can go somewhat undetected in some of those species, but then it hits, one of the bay trees, and they hold their leaves a lot longer, and they've got kind of a real distinct look to them when they've got it. And then people too. I mean, the main front has started on the southeastern coast. Georgia was found over by Savannah back in '04, I believe, and it's sort of slowly moving in. But then we've already had blips and spots in Texas and Arkansas and Louisiana, and I mean, clearly that the beetle's not flying 200 miles to find another tree. It's people whose trees have died and they brought it to deer camp or whatever. So it's the same as emerald ash borer. That's how that thing spreads a lot too. You get people with ash trees that die, they cut them down, they take it to camping or deer camp or their grandpa and grandmas for Christmas fire, all that stuff.
Yeah, I know you shared with me this really interesting picture of some folks up at the UP of Michigan. So that people don't know what the UP is, it's the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and it's just all this firewood getting transported, possibly, to new areas of where there wasn't, say like emerald ash borer or something else. It's an easy way for people to carry these pest and invasive species from one way to the other.
Yeah, it's and we've done a really good job in the last few years with our messaging. There's the big "Don't Move Firewood" campaign, or "Buy it where you burn it." We recognized early on that, holy cow, this is not good. But the scientists recognize stuff, and some of the groups recognize it. But then there's still a whole nother, level, is getting people to recognize it. And that's, they've done some work. Some people know it's not good, but they do it anyway because it's their land and it's none of your business. Others, say, why would I pay $5 for a handful of firewood when I've got a dead tree in back? So it's tricky. It's tricky to get people to not do that, especially when you start looking at some of the finances with it.
Right. So Allison Vogelsong, who goes by Desquad Salvador on Twitter, she just said how "It bugs me" is a great slogan, and it seems like there are a lot of really good slogans out there when it comes to moving firewood. What one do you think so far has been like the most successful, at least down in your area?
I think down here, "Buy it where you burn it" is a good one. because for some reason that seems to be one that people really pick up on. I mean, don't bug me is good, but buy it where you burn it is good. And I think part of that is because down here we've got a lot of, in the deep south, a lot of populations concentrated in cities, Atlanta, Tallahassee, and they sort of make these pilgrimages, so we say. They make a pilgrimage up to the mountains for the weekend. And so the buy it where you burn it, it hits them a little more so they can understand it, because these aren't people that have a dead tree in their backyard. They're probably not people that own a chainsaw, right? They're people from the city who are going to buy firewood somewhere. The key is getting them to buy it where they are, instead of buying it on the north side of Atlanta and carrying it up to Tennessee. If we can get them just drive up there, there's plenty of it there. That's kind of what we're working on. And so that one's worked pretty well. But, again, we've got a lot of people. That works for the city pilgrimage folks. Once you get rural, it's tough. And it's like that all over the country.
Yeah, because I mean, I know, like at my parents' house, like they've got a whole bunch of woods back behind there. It's really easy for us to go down, chop down an old tree and have that, and if we wanted to be able to carry that firewood where we were to go camping. Like we like to go camping up north, maybe up into the UP, and we could very easily transport that invasive pest down here to a whole new area really quickly.
Yeah, yeah, and that happens a lot, and I think people in towns, from what I've seen, are usually fairly good about it. It's the people that are in rural areas that are more independent and more, this is my land, don't tell me what to do with it type attitude. And I think that's just common with being rural. That's sort of rural America's, attitude. It certainly was where I grew up. I mean, there's no denying that.
No, so. I could definitely see it. Do you also think maybe it's, maybe the messaging isn't getting to them as much? The messaging is maybe getting concentrated where the populations are greater because, we can impact more people. And then maybe those smaller towns where there's less people, the messaging isn't getting to them as easily?
I agree 100%. I mean, Georgia's a great example. We've got Atlanta, we've got Savannah, and then we've got 2 or 3 towns that are in the, 100 to 300,000 person range. And then it's very rural for the rest of the state. It's a big state. And so, you're not going to spend a lot of money advertising in some of these counties in the middle of Georgia that have a few thousand people in the county. Yet at the same time, those are the ones that really need to be on the lookout to not move stuff. And it's like that across the region. When population gets concentrated, you go for the biggest bang for your buck. And unfortunately, it leaves a lot of stuff that's kind of either the message just didn't get there well enough, or lost some other way.
So, in theory, possibly the people who are doing the most damage as far as moving those, firewood and thus those potential pest and invasive species are the ones who are getting the least amount of acknowledgement as far as, when it comes to sending them the message to get them to stop doing that. And they're the ones causing the most damage, possibly.
Yeah, that's certainly something we've talked about, and the other part is, how do you get the message across? Is it all electronic? If that's the case, you're kind of taking away a subset of people that don't do electronic stuff. I talked to one older fellow on Friday, and we talked about one of his issues, and I said, well, can I send you a link to some other information? He's like, no, I don't have email, just mail me something. So I had to do this quaint activity of printing out a bunch of stuff today and putting together a whole envelope for him, and thought, man, I haven't done this in eons. But a lot of the older people, that's how they get their information. So if you're not getting it electronically, you got to go through the television or the billboards or the newspapers, and that's so hit and miss. Mm-hmm. It becomes really hard, and you're never going to reach everybody either. So
yeah, so I mean, that sounds like where having those boots on the ground where you can actually go out and meet these people face to face is even more important.
Right, and that's a lot of what I do. Is I work with a lot of people that are boots on the ground. So I work with all the county foresters and the county extension agents, and they are the direct link to landowners. So if you can get them on board with the message, it's the best shot you've got, because they're the ones that are actually going to talk to all these people. There's a level of trust there, right? Locals trust their local extension agent. The local people trust this local state forester. So that's sort of where you got to really concentrate your efforts to try to make it happen.
Mm-hmm. So, like, how is that, like, because we keep hearing about how funding for science and other outreach projects are going to be diminishing or are diminishing. Like, how hard is it for you to be able to help fund those efforts to make sure that those messages get out to those people?
Well, it's tricky, and it's different pools of money from research. So that's part of the good news. I don't get research funding anymore. Outreach funding, with the Forest Service, they've got some pots of money, and part of it is just for management. So this all falls under good management, and that still does have fairly good support, all the way up through Congress as the management arm of things. Research is getting hammered. We know that. I don't know that that's going to change, but I think management is still going to have some support, because that's where, right or wrong, that's where people see the economic impact. Right? If you manage forests right, then you can get more truckloads of logs off there, and then you're helping businesses and yada, yada, yada. So there's still some support there. So it's tricky, but it can be done. There is still support for it. It's definitely not like it was when I was in research and trying to scrounge for research dollars. That said, it's not, we're not getting money thrown at us. But outreach is fairly inexpensive in the overall scheme of things. It's a very big bang for your buck to do outreach versus something else from the perspective of someone funding something. For $100,000 you get a lot of outreach, and you don't really get a lot of science.
Okay.
Sadly is the way it is.
Well,
so.
I mean, that makes sense. I mean, you think of all the equipment and manpower and things that go behind doing research, where outreach, I guess what your biggest cost is probably the people that have to go and do it. The actual supplies that you need is a lot of just time assembling, brochures and other things, and the printing material of that would be my guess. I mean,
the biggest cost is salary and travel.
Okay.
Beyond that, it's honestly, it's not a whole lot. I mean, yeah, there's some printing costs. There's some, but a lot of what I use is things I have collected myself in the field, right? Oh, there's a great example of hypoxylin canker. I'll cut it down, and boom, that's my hypoxylin sample now.
Okay.
I've got all these little boxes of bugs that I take with me, and these are things I've just caught over the years, and I collect them, and excuse me, for stuff that's quarantined, like EAB or some of these other quarantine things. At this point, I know people that work at APHIS, and I can send them an email and say, hey, I have an educational program. Can I get beetles, damage, whatever? And they've all got it in their quarantine labs, and when they're done with it, they can send it over, and I've got the stuff. So
Great.
The network helps a lot. Being able to know who's where and get things, it helps a lot. But
well, yeah, that makes sense, especially since you're talking about having to do a lot of in-person things and knowing those networks of people who actually are those boots on the ground and going out and talking to the public. It seems like you really need to know who it is and have met them face to face and be able to talk to them about different things.
Yeah, so PSA for any students that might be watching and listening, you never know when these people you meet way back when is going to come back up. So be cool and be nice.
Right.
Just never know.
That's good life advice anyways, but definitely good for career advice, because I do find science is so much with networking. It's like who you know and when you know them, and it's just that has led to at least a lot of my opportunities is who I've known personally. It's not necessarily when I just randomly send my CV off to someone. It's more of oh, I know that person, and that leads to this opportunity, which leads to that opportunity. And
yeah, you're 100% right. It's the old not what you know but who you know spiel is sadly how a lot of the world works to varying degrees.
Exactly. So for everyone out there, if you have any questions for Dave or myself, please feel free to send those in via the Periscope chat handle. And obviously, if you're watching this on Periscope after the fact on replay, feel free to send your questions in via our Twitter handles. So one of the things that we had talked about earlier when we were, prepping for today's broadcast was the thought of climate change impacting forests. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't think about. When we think about climate change, we think of the impacts it has in, on the poles up in, the Arctic and down in the Antarctic, how it's, impacting things like polar bears and other cold animals, or how it's impacting those coastal cities or those islands out in the Pacific. How does climate change impact inland forest where you're at?
Yeah, everybody thinks of the polar bear floating away on his chunk of ice, right? So it's much more glamorous than forestry and stuff. But climate change affects things in several ways. There's so there's climate and weather, right? And we had a good talk last week with with Joanna about the difference between climate and weather, right? You pack for weather, you choose where to go for climate. So from a climate perspective, things are getting warmer, right? Things are sort of warming up. And from an insect perspective, because they're ectotherms, the warmer it is, the faster they grow and the bigger they grow. So as temperatures keep getting bigger, you're going to have insects that get bigger faster, and they're going to eat more, and they're going to eat it more quickly. But honestly, some of the big stuff comes down to weather, and that's because we have, with climate change, there's the crazy unpredictability of weather, right? We have droughts that pop up out of nowhere and last for 2-3 months, and then we have major storms, and that's where we get a lot of our stuff happening, is with things like that. And the drought is a really good example. And so down here in the deep south in Georgia and Alabama, we're in the midst of this drought that's been going on since last fall. We have pine all over the place. For those that maybe haven't been here, there's a lot of pine species. And we have this group of beetles called ips that are normally completely secondary things. So they pick off the old and the weak, basically. But when it's a drought, like it's been a drought all over, everything is weak. So we've had these unprecedented outbreaks of this normally secondary beetle. And, so it kills trees that normally wouldn't have been killed. Consequently, there's this glut of wood on the market. So all the prices have taken a nosedive. And so now you've got landowners that are faced with this unpleasant choice of, do I let the beetles keep doing what they're doing, or do I try to cut my trees down and take a super low price and probably a loss? So that's one example of what climate change does, is because it gets warmer, these droughts come up, and then consequently, we never know when it's going to rain, and sometimes it rains and we get floods, and that just gives you a whole nother set of issues. All these things stress the trees. It just depends on where they are and how much it happens. So the unpredictability is really one of the biggest things we have to deal with now, and trying to get people to think about that going forward is sometimes tricky, sometimes not. Trees down here, pine trees, you figure 25 to 30 years for a rotation, right? Corn is a 1-year thing. Trees down here can be 25 to 30 years at sort of the low end. So, think about if you had to figure out, well, what's going to happen the next 3 decades? I don't know. I mean, we've all got guesses, right? We've all got guesses, but we try to tell people to plan on, think about what's going to happen and consider that when you're planting and choosing what to do with your land. There's ways to do forestry that works great, but it's not like it used to be. So we're trying to get them to do some changes to, help deal with this thing.
Yeah, when you're speaking about, all the trees dying, so I'm assuming basically they're just ripe for forest fires or other things like that. I guess, are there any really good examples of forest fires that have been caused by climate change down in your area?
Well, it's always tough to say that climate change caused them. I think probably most people remember the Gatlinburg fire last year. That was certainly not caused by climate change, right? It was caused by a couple idiot teenagers that were lighting matches and that type of thing. Right. But the reason it did what it did was because of climate change, because of this drought the region has. And where that started, up there near Gatlinburg, it's very mountainous. So it's a lot of hardwoods, it's a lot of oaks. And something, I've somewhat recently learned is the reason a lot of those oak forests don't usually burn is because, think of an oak leaf. When they lie flat together like this, they often trap moisture between the leaves. And then anyone who's gone out in the woods and picked up oak leaves, they're almost always wet in between them. Well, because it was so dry for so long, all those oak leaves dried and that moisture evaporated. So you had just a bunch of dry oak leaves loosely stacked up on top of each other. Because that happens so rarely, and at the same time you had kids doing what they were doing and the matches were getting thrown and boom, you've got a fire. All of a sudden you've got this epic fire in a place that rarely burns. So you've got tons of leaf litter, tons of fire fuel, woody and otherwise, on the ground. And the thing just took off, and I forget what the final tally was. I think it was 14 or 15 people died, and I don't even remember how many billions of dollars in damage hit, but there's some unbelievable pictures of people took from the town of Gatlinburg. They were trapped in there. There's fire all over the place. But, that happened because of how dry it was. And that drought was one of the worst they'd seen here in years. So I think it's a fairly plausible thing to say, climate change didn't cause it, but it certainly contributed to the immensity of it all.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. Like, that's something I think a lot of people don't think about, is those kind of like secondary impacts. While it might not have been that initial cause, it added so much, a horrible pun right here, but fuel to the fire that it wouldn't have been that bad. I mean, there still would have been damage. There's still possibly could have been loss of life here, but would it have been to that great extent of where it just devastated that whole area? Who's to say?
Right, and with that, all of a sudden it started getting dry and windy. And I mean, think about what it is when it's 90 degrees and windy and you stick your hand out the window when you're driving. It's like you're in a blow dryer or a dryer. And it was sort of this perfect storm of conditions that happened, and boom, you've got national disaster almost. So certainly, had it been raining, probably wouldn't have happened like it did.
But still, it's just one of those devastating impacts of climate change that we don't necessarily think about, especially in those inland areas. So right. Some of the other things that impact forest health are things like disease and habitat loss. Like, can you talk to us a little bit about those issues when it comes to the forest health?
Yeah, habitat loss is a good one. A good example is all the, I guess it would be urban sprawl, or the urban encroachment. I think that's a term a lot of folks use now, because everyone wants to live in their pretty little chunk of woods. And unfortunately, once, when those chunks of woods are kind of left in the original owner's hands, they're usually taken care of, right? When they're a commercial timber crop, they're taken care of in a fairly decent way. But once it gets sold to a developer, all the management stops. So you can have developers buying, 100, 200 acre chunks of land, but then only developing parts of it here and there, right? A neighborhood here, a neighborhood there. The rest of it is just sort of left to its own devices to grow and to do its thing. And the worst thing, especially down here in the South, is for forests to get neglected. Because with neglect comes overcrowding. With overcrowding comes weakness. With weakness and stress comes beetles. And certainly we don't have mountain pine beetle like out west, which is responsible for millions of hectares of death all the time. But same kind of situation. If you don't manage trees, they get weak and stressed, and then they become vulnerable to all sorts of stuff. And that's something that a lot of the developers and planners don't ever think about. They just think, I've got this great 200 acres on the east side of Atlanta. I can put neighborhoods all over it, but we're going to do it over a period of 10 years. By the end of that 10 years, half of it is, beetle bait, because it's so overstocked and so, sickly and uncared for. So that's a big one, is that whole development. And then you get these neighborhoods that are very tree-ish, a lot of trees in there, which is great, but they're also not taken care of, because a lot of people don't tend to think their trees don't need any care, sadly.
Yeah, I can't think of the last time that I've actively cared for a tree, I guess.
Yeah, and so like we say, think how much time you spend on your flower bed every year. Mm-hmm. Just fertilize your tree. Right? Like once a year, give it a half hour of love. That's what we try to tell people in urban environments. Like make sure it's watered, give it some fertilizer every year, and you're going to keep it healthy and living longer. And tree removal in urban areas is a expensive thing. It is not cheap to take down a tree in urban areas. So it behooves the landowner to keep it healthy and alive as long as possible. So there's the whole land use thing, and they've had these discussions a lot out west because that's where stuff burns a lot more. Wildfires out there are always creeping into neighborhoods, it seems like. And one side of the coin is don't build in the woods because the woods burn. The other side is why isn't the insert government state entity here protecting my home? And it's tricky. I mean, if you've bought some land, you've got the right to do on it what you want. But at the same time, if you build your house on the side of a hill where it rains all the time, don't be surprised if it slides down in a mudslide. So it's that's probably a whole nother talk for another time. But it's something that we got to think about as far as the forest health stuff. It's the forest doesn't stop where a neighborhood starts. It sort of keeps going. And a lot of people don't think of that. They think, well, I live in this neighborhood with trees. Well, but that's still kind of forestish. If you've got a lot of trees there, you're still susceptible to all the same stuff as it would be if your house wasn't there. So.
Yeah, that makes sense that it is just that extension. It just might not be the heart of the forest, but it's still part of it, and it's still connected to those forests that are around your town.
Right. And, we saw this last summer. We had some southern pine beetle outbreaks in South Georgia, and these outbreaks were on these fairly well-to-do islands. So the homes were quite nice. The lots were quite big. The trees were super old. So yes, it looked pretty and great, but it was also, if you've got a pine tree that old, it's just, it's on borrowed time basically. So then these beetles came in and started killing all these big old trees. And the landowner said, well, what can you do about it? I said, well, you cut them down because they've lived basically twice as long as we expect them to. And people don't want to hear that, right? They've paid who knows how much, easily 7 figures for these areas, and you're taking their big pine tree from the middle of their lot. Well, there's no good answer. It's like, well, sorry, you probably have enough money to put something else in if you want, but these old trees are going to die, and a lot of people don't think of that either. The old trees just die. So.
Yeah, you just assume they kind of are going to be there forever. They've kind of become, that iconic figure of that home, and to have it not there, you kind of forget, well, these are actually living things and do die.
Right. Landowners don't want to hear that their trees died just because it was old. Right. Think, no, that's not true. It kind of is, In that case, it was the whole island was, these super old pine trees, and the entomologists come out there and they say, well, no crap, southern pine beetle hit this is perfect for it. The homeowner says, how can you stop it? Well, you cut down all the trees basically. That's how you stop it. So it's tough to get them to accept the tree's fate, I guess is a good word.
Right. Yeah, I know, I can't imagine, some of the homes around my hometown without all of their trees. If someone came in and said, all right, it's their time's up, you need to chop them all down, it would just completely change the look of the town. And, I can imagine people would not be that happy. And those aren't even 7-figure homes. Those are just your average everyday home, and people would still be quite upset. So.
Yeah. And, that's another thing for the students out there. You have to learn how to talk to people in a very sensitive way sometimes. In some cases, depending on where you are, some people are just, oh boy. So some people are entitled, so you have to tiptoe around kind of that. Other people, it's just devastating when you see someone who's got a big chunk of land and they're like, this is going to be their kid's college money, and a beetle outbreak comes through and kills it all. You feel horrible telling them that, I'm really sorry, but you've lost all this.
Yeah, I mean, or it could be the tree that their parents put there when they first did it. It's that memento of their parents who have long since passed. It can be very devastating personally for people.
Yeah, and honestly, nothing feels worse when they say, "Oh yeah, come look at this tree," and when you go out there, you can immediately see, "Oh, this one's gone," and then they start saying, "This is where Grandma came off the boat from Norway, and that was her first tree swing," and you think, "Oh God, no." Okay. So it's tricky, but it's a skill I don't think I had. That skill wasn't honed nearly as well as it needed to be when I first started this, and it's a total trial by error thing. Like, I spent a lot of time just listening to my elder peers and mentors, and to see how they talk to people like this, because boy, takes a skill.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those secondary skills that we don't necessarily think about as we're going through undergrad or grad school. Is some of those ways of just how do you talk to people? Is I mean
Yeah.
that's a very valued skill that we don't necessarily put enough thought into as we're going through school.
Yeah, and just the way to talk about science to people that aren't scientists is something that's not probably well taught to people as you're going through grad school too. There's a good way to translate things uh, where you don't sound ivory towerish, where you don't sound pompous, where you sound human. And it takes time, it takes effort to do that type of thing. And that would have been, I had one person ask me, well, what's the one skill you wish you had learned in grad school? And I said it would have been how to speak human about science.
Right.
So
Yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it because I know when I was first getting into grad school, they taught us how to give presentations at conferences and other things, but there never really was that. How do you talk to just that random person that you meet on the street about it? Like, we were told to give elevator talks, but they were talks to other scientists that if you met them at a conference. It wasn't like this is how you talk to someone who doesn't have that science background at all and how you bridge that gap of knowledge. Because I know if I was talking to someone who was a physicist or some other discipline, it would be that same person that's on that street who has no knowledge of that and would need someone to break it down for me.
Yeah. One of the best questions I ever got in my PhD exams. So at Wisconsin, we had written and then oral things. So one of my best questions during my writtens was to explain this science paper to four different people: a second grade teacher, a congressman, a fellow scientist in another discipline, and then my grandpa, who my committee knew was a farmer. So, and then a farmer. And that was, on the surface, it seems like, oh, a piece of cake, but that was super challenging to be able to explain that in a way that made sense for all those different levels of knowledge.
Yeah, no, that's a really good exercise. One that, you know, I think I would benefit from just trying to do right now. It's
Yeah,
just because you think about it, it's a completely different way of how you would talk to everyone based on where they're coming from. So
right.
yeah, and it definitely helps benefit you when you're having to go out and talk to those people face to face. You're going to be meeting different people from different walks of life, so being able to adjust the message of, hey, don't move your firewood, finding the
Mhm.
different ways to say that so it the people get it, is definitely a real skill.
Yeah, and on that "don't move your firewood," then what do you do when they say "why not"? Right? Because some people are going to come back at you with like "why not?"
Because I just
Yeah,
said not
right.
to, please.
Because all the bumper stickers say not to. But then you have to know how to say, well, because how do you then give them the science reasons why not, in reasons that make sense and have meaning to them. That's the trick. And you got some people you'll never reach, right? Some people you're not going to convince any way or the other. But some people, they really do want to know why not, and you have to be able to tell them why not, sort of in a way that impacts them enough to get them to change behaviors. So
All right. Um, so speaking of why not, anyone who has any questions out there as to maybe why not or other issues when it comes to Forest House, please definitely get those in because we'll be wrapping up here shortly. So I guess one of my questions is, what can the people out there who are watching right now, what is it that they could do today or this week, to actually help the forest around them? What's like the biggest things that they can do?
I think the biggest things they can do are be sensible when it comes to moving things. And I'm talking the firewood, I'm talking plants. Potted plants are a huge way stuff gets moved from point A to point B. And the potted plant industry, has been implicated in the past, and the clause came out, and the lobbyists in Congress were like, no, it's not us. But I mean, we know these trees that get, shipped in from all over the place, stuff can live in them. So it's the buy local thing, right? Like that's all common with all the foodies now, buy local, eat local. That's really the only way to really help protect the forests is don't move stuff around. If you're in a position to influence what happens in like a new neighborhood, right? Or if your parents or you buy a house somewhere new, don't bring stuff from where you used to live and put it there. Our neighbor lady just moved in and brought all this stuff from her place in North Georgia down, and it's tree species that do not live in the Piedmont area. And I looked in her yard the other day. I said, "Is that a hemlock tree?" She said, "Oh yeah, I got it from the mountains where I used to live." And I was just like, "Oh my God, no, okay." But that's a discussion we'll have another day. But that's how stuff gets moved around is people, and I get it. You bring the comforts from home here, right? Our ancestors did that. That's how we get a lot of these really devastating invasive species. Dutch elm disease, chestnut blight. It came because people brought in things they liked from home. And for people out there listening and caring, just don't do that. There's cool stuff wherever you're going. Use that cool stuff from there.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good message, because I think sometimes we forget, like we hear about, don't move your firewood, but moving other plants and things, to areas. Like I can imagine my mother, digging up plants from her garden and taking them with her because she liked that certain plant. And I know that she's given, plants away that she's had here to other people, and who knows exactly where they've, taken them from there. So
yeah. And even beyond forestry, some of the soil folks will say, you don't know what microbes are in that soil. Even though it might be something like a flower from your garden in Michigan, you take it down to Tennessee, there's maybe no pests on it, but who knows what's up with the soil microbes there. It's a whole different community of stuff. I don't think they know how impactful that is, but from an ecological standpoint, you're just completely transplanting stuff. So it's probably best to not do that.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like the same as if I, took, some blood from myself and gave it to somebody else. You're doing the exact same thing. All that body chemistry that I have, I'm just now implanted in someone else. And it's the same thing with the soil. It's, you're completely bringing something new and novel that could be potentially devastating for that new area.
Absolutely. Right. Absolutely. So, yeah, that'd be the big message is don't move it. And then, just, work on talking to people in a human way. Because, what I have found is the quickest way to lose someone's attention is to start speaking science-y. That works great at professional conferences and with your peers and that type of thing. But the minute you get outside of the university bubble, I found there's sort of three, what I have found is there's three groups of people. There's the ones that have interest and education and want to hear the sciencey stuff. There's the ones that are just huge, insert university here fans, right? Go Dogs, go whatever. And then there's the ones who you're just this ivory tower, guy from the university. You don't tell me what to do. So part of it is just like diffusing some of that stuff. When I do a lot of my outreach, yes, I have a PhD. I never lead with that ever. I never refer to myself as doctor. My name's Dave. And if they want to, if they ask, sure, I'll tell them, right? But I'm never going to lead with, hi, I'm Dr. Coyle, because you've already lost a big chunk of people that are already like, guy's a jerk, just from saying that. And it's funny, my wife said, well, don't you want to tell people, that you're a doctor? I said, well, in time, but not going to lead with that. We're not in a hospital. Right. In that case, yes, lead with the doctor thing. But when you're just trying to talk to them on their farm, it's a very different way to go about it, and it takes a different tact.
Do you feel like they're better able to trust you when you're just kind of like hey, I'm Dave versus I'm Dr. Dave, that automatically is that shutdown of like, okay, we can't quite trust him because he's going to tell us what to do versus he's going to listen to us and hear how it is we need to do things, and then, help us implement, what it is that we need to get done, but still be good citizens of the earth.
Yeah, great point, Nicole. It's like the listening part too, right? Don't go in there guns blazing. I'm Dr. So-and-so. You need to do this. I always ask questions first. Tell me about your situation. Tell me about your land. Tell me about this. You got to build a rapport with people if you think they're going to take anything you say to heart. If you don't do that, they're going to, they may just think, well, I could have got this information from, the web. I could have just downloaded a fact sheet or something. So you got to really let them know you're human, for starters. And, you gotta listen. You gotta let them know you're human. And I do think that they need to trust you. And, if people come in aggressive, they're tougher to trust. Mm-hmm. So this has been my experience, right? It also probably helps that I grew up very rural on a farm, so I can relate to a lot of things they're going through. I had one incident once where I was fairly new to this, and I was with an older forester who'd been there for years and years and years, but they automatically saw me as, who's the new guy, right? It was this older couple, and they were trying to hook up this wagon to a tractor or a PTO or something. And I could see they were struggling, like they were old. And so I just sort of walked over. I said, may I help you with this? And I hooked up the PTO to the tractor, and, I got greasy, whatever, no big deal. And I heard later that was the one thing that they then decided they could trust me, because he just jumped in and helped hook up a tractor. And I told the guy I was with, I said, that doesn't make any sense. That has zero things to do with any of the stuff we talked about to them. But for some people, it doesn't matter. It's seeing that you're human and you'll help and care and can do some of that stuff.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest thing, is that caring aspect of like, hey, I mean, yes, I do care if you listen to the message I have to say, but in the end, it's like, I want to just help you out, and no matter what it is, I'm going to lend a hand and help you, when I see that there's a need for help out there. And I think that really does help people to trust you when you're being more willing to lend that hand, whether or not it has anything to do with why you're even out there.
Yeah, it's true. And, I've heard stories of, some people, it takes years to build rapport with a certain person or group. And they'll say, man, I've been working on that relationship for 15 years, and they finally invited me in. Some of it's, and it's long term sometimes, especially if you take one of these, extension positions. As one of my colleagues said, I have to just let them tell me I'm wrong for a year or so till they accept me, and then I can get in with my message. Mm-hmm. So we kind of joked about it. He's like, oh yeah, I had to go down to so-and-so again and get told I was full of crap again. So, it's been 6 months now. We should be turning the corner pretty soon.
Yeah, because we joke in my hometown that you're not really a truly a member of this town until like you've been here for several generations, unless like your grandparents or great grandparents lived here. You're still a newbie to this town. And yeah. I think kind of like the same thing that you're experiencing when you go out and talk to people. It's like you really have to integrate yourself into that daily life until they can finally trust you and you are a member of that community.
Yeah, and especially, this may sound silly, but, I've lost my northern accent to anyone from the north. But to a lot of people down here, I still sound like I'm a Yankee. Mm-hmm. So there's that, right? So right. That's a big deal to some people down here. It's like, oh, he's not from here at all. Even though I've been here for quite a while. But he talks funny. So there's some of that stuff, too, that occasionally will happen.
Right, yeah, because it definitely identifies you right away that, oh, you're not from here. So
yeah, and you get that. Well, where are you from? I said, oh, I live up in Athens. No, boy, where are you from? Where are you from?
Yeah.
All right, Minnesota. So
So yeah, I could get away with it real easy because having spent a number of my years down in Texas and Georgia, I can pick up on that southern accent real fast.
Yeah. I'm not good at faking it yet. So I just try to I try to charm them with my aw shucks country attitude, I guess. I don't know.
Yep. So for everyone out there, if you've got any last second questions as we wrap things up, definitely send them in right away. Otherwise, we're going to start wrapping up here. So you kind of like gave us like the last, things that, people can do. Is there any like other like big things that people need to know about when it comes to forest health, that you can think of, like last minute, like buzz thing to like stick into their heads?
Well, the buzz thing now is pollinators, right? So it's pollinator week on Twitter. We're just learning that, there's been the bee decline stuff a lot lately, and we're learning the impact of native pollinators. So not honeybees, right? All these different native bee species. There's been quite a bit of good work done that shows where you have forests that are free of invasive species, especially the invasive shrubs and invasive grasses, where you've got a really diverse, healthy forest. You've got a diverse, healthy native pollinator guild, and that group of insects is extremely important to all of the things that need pollination, all the crops and all that. So, forest health it depends on kind of what your objective is. If it's just getting logs on trucks, you kind of want one thing. You maybe don't want as much of that stuff growing in the middle. Pines in lines, we call them, right? You've got basically agricultural crop of trees, but there's a lot of objectives for forestry that isn't just truckloads of wood, So managing forests is tricky. It doesn't matter if you're in the south, the north, the east, the west, wherever. It all depends on what you want out of it, right? And some people want to just let nature take its course, and that's totally cool. If you do that, keep in mind that you could theoretically be where a beetle outbreak starts or a pest outbreak starts by letting nature take its course, because these things are natural, which may be fine unless your neighbor's objective is just log loads of wood. So there's some things to deal with there, but the biggest thing for forests right now is the invasive species and just planning for the future. We're going to keep having these droughts. We're going to keep having some funky weather. It's probably going to keep getting warmer. Just got to plan for it and work with it like we can.
Great. Well, that's definitely some great advice, and I want to thank Dave for coming on Scicomm Monday. It definitely was a very interesting, and I learned a lot for sure. So hopefully everyone out there also learned a lot. And so, Dave, thank you again for being on Scicomm Monday with all of us today.
Thanks, Nicole. I appreciate it. And if anyone else has any questions, you can find me offline too. I'm completely happy to talk about my experiences doing communication in a region I didn't grow up in. So it's, there's some stories. So catch me in a meeting. We'll talk stories.
Sounds good for sure. It's like I'm always up for stories. So if we ever actually get to hang out in person versus just on a broadcast here, I'll have to shoot you up for some stories, and hopefully other people will too.
Deal.
So, all right. So if you want to get a hold of Dave, if you're watching this and we're too shy to ask questions, or if you're watching this on a replay, you can feel free to get a hold of him at his Twitter handle, which is at Dr. Dave Coyle. If you want to get a hold of me, you can either reach me at Scicomm Monday or at my personal handle of WildlifeBioGal. And then just a reminder for everybody that next week we'll be talking to Melissa Marquez. She does a lot of shark work, and she's down in New Zealand. So we'll get to broadcast live from New Zealand, which was really cool. And it was fun doing the pre-test with her on everything, because it's some really neat landscapes that they have there. But she'll be talking about sharks and outreach, and we'll get a tour of the the Island Bay Marine Education Center Bait House Aquarium that they have there in Wellington, New Zealand. And then if the weather is good, Melissa will also take us out to the tide pools out on the Cook Strait, which is the strait that divides the North and South Islands there in New Zealand. And we'll get to see some of the species that live there in the tide pools out in the Pacific Ocean. And so also with that, I want to make sure that I thank all of the Scicomm Monday patrons out there, the Patreon patrons that we have. I really appreciate your support with helping to make sure that this broadcast keeps happening. And if you're interested, please feel free to go out to our Patreon site and help support Scicomm Monday. All the support that we get definitely does help to keep this broadcast going, because it does take a lot of effort to get this out to you each week. And then for everybody else, I'd like to thank you for tuning in today. If you have any questions, like I said earlier, feel free to send the tweet out to myself at Scicomm Monday or at WildlifeBioGal. And with that, I'm going to say go out, explore, do some science, have some fun, and we'll hopefully see you on the next Scicomm Monday.